I'm Batman.
Well, I hardly think so. The real Cape Crusader calls his crime-fighting cohorts when he's running late.
I had to walk. I couldn't get Raj on the back of my scooter.
I've said this before and I'll say it again. Aquaman sucks.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us. Well, it is a Friday, and you know what that means. It is time once again for the Geekend, and the topic for tonight's Geekend, I know we usually use Friday as an excuse to get away from the coronavirus and all the talk about it, but it has impacted our world in a pretty significant way, and not just the news world, also some of the things that deal with geek culture, and specifically when we're talking about esports, competitive gaming, and also movies. It's had some pretty significant impacts on the way that we look at all of these things, and that's going to be our topic of discussion tonight. And tonight we have Chris and my brother, a first-timer to the Geekend, Levi, so we're going to go ahead and go to them. The main thing that I wanted to really dive in, and just so you know, my brother has some experience with this. He's actually started his own esports company, and he plays on a couple different teams. You've done Valorant. I know that I've seen you do CSGO before. So, yeah, you've got a little background in this, right?
Yeah, so I actually helped Mississippi State University start their first esports program, and when I joined and kind of worked on it with my friends from the get-go, which I was not on the executive committee, I just helped them grow certain teams and aspects of it. We went from about 20 members to now our Discord currently has 600 members. So we became the largest student organization on campus that's considered a club and not athletics. So it's definitely grown a lot since we've been there, and that makes sense because the demographic is 18 to 24-year-olds for esports and that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, that tends to be the ages that most people go to college too, so that does definitely make sense. So I kind of wanted to go to you first since you've got some expertise on this. When it comes to the pandemic and how it's changed our world in a lot of ways, some ways that it may not even go back to the way it was beforehand. So what are some of the pros and cons of the pandemic on the esports community? How has it affected not only the popularity of people watching, but also people playing?
So it has definitely hurt the physical event industry for esports because that is a giant thing, especially for the competitive side. Specifically, Counter-Strike and other games have had physical events where they had 5,000 plus attendees and over $1 million prize pots for these physical events. And all of those have been almost exclusively shut down, especially since most of them are international. So they're usually somewhere in the EU or surrounding area. So a lot of them have been canceled and are canceled until further notice. And as far as actually playing the game and viewership has gone, a lot of things have just moved to online tournaments because it's really easy to do that since it's a virtual sport as opposed to a real sport. So, I mean, it makes sense that people would still be playing and watching over the internet when that's where it's played typically anyway. And it doesn't have those physical events, but numbers are actually on the rise for viewership and for player growth since the pandemic has occurred because a lot of people who used to play are now back at home.
Yeah, well, I think that makes sense. All of us are kind of back at home, so an activity that can kind of keep you busy when all of that's going on, it makes sense that would kind of rise in popularity. I mean, we were talking, Chris, you and I were just a couple weeks ago when we were doing our big Animal Crossing show that the numbers that this thing has been churning out are insane because it's something that people can do from their house, and now you don't even need a physical game. You don't even have to go to a game store to get this thing. You can download it. It's right there on your system. And so this has had a lot of really interesting ramifications in the gaming community as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, although I think one nuanced question I guess I would like to pose is that basically independent streamer versus organized esports. I'm curious as to what the difference has been because as was mentioned, you know, the physical tournaments aren't taking place. The physical setup, of course you can do it online, but it seems as though, you know, esports was rising in a way, and gaining more mainstream acceptance. But I think part of that was having people on stage, having crowds of people cheering, and you have a camera that can pan over it, and you have commentators making it look like a sporting event. So I suspect that maybe that has been stunted a little bit because it's been set back. And so I am curious how the more corporate industry has been affected versus independent, like say Twitch streamers who don't have that overhead and don't have to worry about that level of organization. Someone can just hop on Twitch and find somebody and start watching them. I wonder, have they both benefited equally, or has one benefited more than the other?
So I can directly speak on that a little bit because I recently started a tournament organization company, and we are hosting all of our tournaments completely online. So it has made it to a degree more difficult because you have technical issues and people having good internet at their houses so that you can communicate with them effectively. And it has put strains on that end because you can't have everybody all in the one place at one time for a production style event. So not everybody's on the same page. We're using a lot of virtual meetings like we are currently using Discord. And really it has stunted it in that way as we're just doing it differently because unlike real sports, you can actually still play over the internet. So it has hurt it to a degree without having those physical tournaments. But on the industry side, numbers are actually rising as far as player counts go in several different games. Like currently, I just have Steam charts pulled up, which if you don't know about it is one of the bigger PC game sale places. It's one of the biggest marketplaces online for PC games. And just to run through the top few, and this is currently live players, there's 511,000 people playing Counter-Strike. There's 320,000 people playing Dota. 95,000 people playing Grand Theft Auto. 75,000 playing PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. So it's not hurting for people playing. It's rather the physical tournament organizers have lost a ton of money because they've had to cancel events. I know specifically there was an event that was supposed to be held for Counter-Strike that was in what they like to call the Cathedral of Counter-Strike because it's where the first major occurred, and that was in Copenhagen, Germany. And it got canceled, and they lost a ton of money. I meant Denmark, by the way. I didn't mean Germany. But it got canceled because they just couldn't have it. They had to cancel this right as soon as the outbreak came down, and they were looking at losing something like $250,000 from having to cancel because everybody had already purchased their tickets. The city got shut down a week before the event was supposed to kick off, and that has happened with a ton of stuff in esports. So it's kind of just moved to online, and it's changing the tournament organization side, but people are playing more than ever because everybody's stuck at home.
I think, though, that it can have an effect on the legitimacy, and I realize that that's a completely intangible concept. Like, you can't quantify how legitimate a sport seems. But especially to people that are a little bit older, that didn't really grow up, like, even millennials didn't grow up with a very vibrant esports community. That's really something that only Gen Z has been accustomed to. And so, since, me and Chris being millennials, you being in Gen Z, I think that there may still be at least that bit of a stigma that was really kind of going away because you could turn on ESPN and there's esports. And you can't really do that anymore because ESPN wants the big physical event where people are coming together in a big stadium. That's kind of gone away, which is a real shame because have you seen ESPN lately? It's been crap ever since this whole thing started. I mean, they are hurting for some programming. So it's a real shame that they don't even have that to fall back on.
That was one thing I was wondering about, is would ESPN try to pick up some esports stuff to fill in gaps while they didn't have live sports to cover? It doesn't seem to have been the case, although it may be a contractual thing.
Well, that may be it, but I think it's that legitimacy factor. I think ESPN, in their mind, for it to be a sport, it needs to have people gathering and a thing where you can do a lot of high production value. And the way that it is right now, I mean, esports was getting some of that, and now it's really not. So I think that may be it. Because, I mean, ESPN, I'm not trying to just bash them, but they think like traditional sports. And if you're not having a big gathering where you can do a lot of fancy production with it, where you're just having to rely on a guy's webcam in his house, they're not going to be as apt to put that on television because it doesn't look like TV programming. How has the lack of traditional sports affected the esports community?
So I definitely think that it's growing, and this is just anecdotal, can't back it up with numbers, but a ton of the people that I play games with, they're all competitive people, and that's why they play competitive games. So, like, these are guys that grew up in high school playing basketball, playing baseball, playing football, and they still talk about it. Like, one of my dearest friends, they talk about the Ravens and the Saints almost every single day. Like, they are very into the NFL, and I guess it allows them to kind of scratch that nerve or hit that, competitive drive by also having esports there. So it kind of definitely is, I would say, and this is just anecdotal, like I said, but I would definitely say that it is there for people that have been missing out on it, especially like people picking up mobile games that are centered around real sports too. It's kind of giving them that itch to scratch, and so to speak.
I mean, I can even understand that from a personal standpoint, because even though I was never I played a little in Little League, but I was never a big baseball player. But I love baseball so much that I'm playing a lot of baseball now just because I can't watch my Braves on TV. So again, just from personal, just like you were saying, not really something I can back up with the numbers. But the fact that I don't have any physical sports in my life are part of the reason that I'm playing a little bit more baseball on my PS4 than I was formerly. Are esports going to see a permanent boost because of this? Is this something that now we're in an environment where esports, because it's picked up maybe some extra viewers because it didn't have people that don't have traditional sports now are going to be transitioning to where they're now esports fans permanently? Or do you think that it more or less goes back to the way it was beforehand as soon as we see baseball and college football and basketball starting to resume and pick up speed a little bit more? Do you think that this is a lasting effect or no?
I can't speak specifically to the rise in numbers recently, but I can speak to the legitimacy that has been brought to esports recently. Specifically, there are a couple of large team organizations that are owned by people that are in real sports. For example, there is basketball, like plenty of basketball money in the company 100 Thieves, which is an esports organization. They have shareholders that play in the NBA. Specifically, I know, and rest in peace, but Kobe Bryant had money in esports organization teams. And it really has been on the rise for legitimacy. And I can tell you personally, just from like running a company that is in that sphere, only to a small degree because we are just starting out, but there is legitimacy on the rise for it, because we're aiming at high school, collegiate, and eventually to get into the pro scene. And there are large organizations involved in high school and in collegiate spheres that did not exist 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, even the Mississippi State esports program didn't have a single live event until last year, and then it had 3 within 1 year, and one of them culminated in having like 6 different schools and 600 live attendees. So I definitely think that there is a spike of people that are currently online, and that might go down eventually, but I think it's on the rise like any classic sport is in popularity, just because there are more people to watch more things in like niche markets. So I definitely think that it's increasing.
Kind of playing off of that, with there being like you were talking about, an increase in popularity that you can see. One thing that I really find fascinating about that is the vast majority of classic sports, traditional sports, are actually in the decline. And I don't mean that in that they're making less money or anything, because they're actually making more. But like Major League Baseball and NFL and a lot of the pro sports, they're not what we call growth sports. In other words, you're not seeing an increased number in fans. You have an increased number of people that are, just by population, but as far as a percentage of that population, you're not really seeing a net growth. The only exception to that is NASCAR, interestingly enough. But esports is. And with esports, you're seeing a percentage of the population that is willing to go to that market to seek out esports events grow. And I think a big part of it is overhead. Because if I'm just like you were talking about earlier, just wanting to scratch that itch of being able to watch some kind of competitive event, and I have a choice between going to an NFL game that's going to cost me and one friend like $200 to go to, or a Major League Baseball game, which even if I go to see him play a crappy team is going to cost me at minimum 100 to 150 if it's just me and a friend, or esports where I literally can just sit in my house and turn on Twitch and watch a full tournament. I mean, you got to admit that it has a competitive advantage from an economic standpoint.
My outside perspective coming into this, past few months is that esports was on a steady trend upward. And I do think we probably experienced some sort of spike in interest. As things, hopefully begin to wind down and things get back to whatever normal is going to be, I think you are going to come down off of that spike, but I think you're still going to continue an upward trend. This time, actually, maybe at a slightly faster rate. So I think you're not going to keep all your viewers when they hop on to any type of entertainment. You're not going to keep everyone long term. But I think the growth rate, which is probably the more important number, will probably be higher going forward regardless. One thing I do want to mention when it comes to the legitimacy that we talked about, as someone who really doesn't follow esports that closely, I mean, I watched Twitch streams from time to time, and I'm generally familiar, but I don't follow very closely. I'm still aware of that there was news coverage about the contract for Doublelift, who is an esports player. When the news starts following contract negotiations for players like they do in professional sports, I have to feel like that's a good sign.
I think that's definitely a good tripwire to keep your eye on. I didn't know that, but yeah, I mean, if a professional sports company is starting to follow basically what we would call in the college football world, your recruiting, not just the actual event, but what goes on behind the scenes, that's probably a pretty good indication that you're definitely rising in popularity.
Explicitly with Doublelift, he's one of the highest earning players of all time because he carried his team to win what would be LCS titles for the game that he plays. And he was on Team Liquid, and there was a bunch of contract negotiation because people like this, players of this caliber, are making north of $30,000 or $50,000 a month. So their contracts are, I mean, not on the level of like NFL or MLB players. They are very hefty sums of money for somebody who plays a video game online all day. So these contracts are definitely followed because there is some debate about whether or not the players have this kind of value. But with tourneys getting such big money behind them, for instance, people like Echo Fox run by Kevin Durant, or people like 100 Thieves run by the singer Drake, with that kind of money behind these events and them wanting to see them go to just see what kind of growth they can get out of it. There's definitely legitimacy in it and money being put into the scene, and I think that it's on track to become as popular as real sports. And to give a little bit of a key onto that legitimacy point once again, this is a quote from Steve Borenstein, the chairman of Activision Blizzard, who is previously the former CEO of ESPN and the NFL Network, who came over to Activision Blizzard, the company that has created World of Warcraft, Overwatch, some of the Call of Duty games.
Guitar Hero.
He's over there. Yeah, he's over their esports division now, and he said, "I believe esports will rival the biggest traditional sports leagues in terms of future opportunities, and between advertising, ticket sales, licensing, sponsorships, and merchandising, there are tremendous growth areas for this nascent industry." And I think that kind of speaks to the legitimacy of it because, I mean, he was the CEO of ESPN and the NFL Network. He was making plenty of money over there, and he has swapped his career over to esports. And there are traditional sports players who are putting investments into esports to keep their money safe. And it is definitely a volatile field, so it's nothing like a stock option or anything like that. But
yeah, it's the Bitcoin
big people,
of sports.
Yeah, to a degree, I guess. But the big players in real sports have faith in this, and I think that speaks volumes to where the scene will be and how seriously it will be taken in 10 years. I mean, just think about it at the early 2000s,
Yeah.
esports had maybe tournaments of like $300 or $400, maybe 1,000 or more at the very big tournaments. But now we're seeing prize pots like the Intel Grand Slam, which is literally $1.5 million. So like, things are growing.
Well, it's also really hilarious when you consider how often, Levi, that our dad told us that we would never make any money playing video games, that was just ridiculous. But, you know, back then you couldn't. But
Yeah, he couldn't have seen it coming.
no, it's not his fault. He's not a futurist. But I think that does speak to a truism that comes up even in politics. Me being a political commentator first and foremost, I can tell you that one thing that a lot of politicians like to do is look at when they're trying to observe who's most likely to win an election, they look at Vegas. And why do they look at Vegas? Because if a person is willing to put money on something, that's a pretty good indication of how much they trust the likelihood of that thing happening. Which also, I don't want to get off into the weeds here, I also find hilarious that right now Joe Biden, who is the only candidate for the Democratic Party, has only an 80% chance of winning the nomination, according to Vegas. But anyway, that kind of speaks to exactly what you're talking about, that once you have people that are willing to put not only some money, but a pretty hefty investment in something, that is at least an indicator that they've got a lot of confidence in it. And it's a much better sign of what is to come. And speaking of big money, I wanted to get off a little bit into the movie industry as well, because I think we're seeing a similar phenomenon happening with movies. And with the advent of the popularity of streaming, transitioning now from video game streaming to movies, and some of the new video on demand, I know that this has been something that's been especially big with kids' movies, with everybody, and especially parents being locked up in their homes with their kids. They got to find something to entertain their kids. You've seen Universal release Trolls World Tour, just video on demand. Never went to theaters. Same thing with the new movie that's coming out, Scoob, which is, of course, a new rendition of the Scooby-Doo franchise. They're just going straight to video. And so this is something that we've just not seen in a really long time, that this pandemic comes in and it completely restructures, in a lot of ways, the structure of the entire industry, that instead of going to theaters and waiting for 60 days, we're seeing a transition happen to where videos are just going straight to your home and being streamed. Is that something that just ends the traditional movie theater from here on out?
I think this goes back to the previous discussion we had, right? Are you going to adapt or not? And the difference, I think, in this situation is that the movie theaters have, or at least the movie theater companies have, possibly a better situation to try to adapt to the current, climate. I think the whole coronavirus issue, people staying home, has somewhat accelerated something that was already naturally occurring anyway. Some trends that were already in place. It's just that now it's kind of forced the hand of, businesses that run these physical movie theaters to have to compete with online streaming now in a way that they didn't have to before, because at least they had that part of the market cornered where they got dibs first. Whereas now it's maybe not, as certain of a thing.
So to give an analogy in another economic sense, it's kind of like how industry is probably already moving towards automation, but if all of a sudden you have, for example, a minimum wage spike or a big labor shortage, that just kind of pushes that faster in that direction.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah, the idea is that something has come in from the outside and has upset the slow growth trend and has accelerated it. And so now the question is, are you going to fight it or are you going to adapt to it? And it seems as though the movie theater companies are going to try to fight it, but I don't think the natural trend of the market is on their side. So I think you might see some adapt and some fight it, and I think the ones who adapt are the ones who will still be around in 5 years.
Yeah, from a technology standpoint, that tends to usually be the way things go.
Well, it just makes sense, right? Because even since like 2002 or 3 when Netflix came out, movie theaters have been on a downward trend because never before did you have access to just thousands of movies at the click of a button. And I can't tell you how many people I know that have like smart TVs or smart devices attached to their TV, like a Roku or Fire Stick or something, where they get most of their content from that device. So I would say that most people probably get their movie watching out during that time. I know I have certainly gone to the movies less, especially since Netflix has been on the rise and since I've been in college. I just go to the movie theater less. I only go when there's something big like a Marvel movie or some drama that I'm excited about, or, you know, some big comedy that's going to hit there first. And people even try to circumvent that to a degree and have been for quite some time, although it is illegal. There's still a large group of people that get their movies and never go to the theater just because they have like a cracked Fire Stick or something of that nature that gives them access to movies earlier than they should be. And people just skip out on the theater experience altogether. And it kind of makes sense because, like, there's delivery food now where you can eat in at the house, and there's on-demand video services, and there's Postmates that'll deliver your groceries, and Walmart grocery pickup, and everything is just becoming more and more disconnected. So I feel like that's kind of the market trend because it's just what people want to a degree. I mean, would you rather sit in your nice recliner and living room with your family, or would you like to have a 2-year-old screaming in the back of your ear while you try and watch a movie? I would definitely pick my house like 9 times out of 10.
Right, and I think that that's a trend that most people are picking at, because I remember there was an article, I want to say it was almost a full year ago, that was asking about, could you see maybe in 10, 15 years? And I was like, 10, 15 years, that's a hilarious timeline. But they were like, in 10, 15 years, do you think people will just pay like $40, $50 to watch movies in their homes? And I'm sitting there like, have you never been to a movie? It cost you that to watch it in the theater. If you go with just, I mean, if you've got a family, like if it's you and your wife and a couple of kids, there's no way you're getting out of that movie theater for less than $60, $70 if you buy snacks and tickets and everything else. And so, yeah, I'd 10 times rather sit in my living room, and if I got to go to the bathroom, I can pause it. I could eat popcorn, but I could also just make dinner and have my dinner right there and not have anybody giving me the stink eye when I sneak a Taco Bell 12-pack into the movie theater to eat it there. Like, the advantages are really big, and I think with the exception of what you were talking about, except for maybe a new Star Wars movie or a new Marvel movie, there's just not that much that makes me, oh, I have to see this on the big screen. Pretty much anything that's animated, I'm fine with waiting for it to come out on one of the streaming services, and that's typically how I watch movies now. And by the way, studies have shown that this is something that's very indicative of younger people. They said that the overall sales, like overall movie ticket sales, have remained largely stagnant over the past decade. But when you look at the age demographics of the people going, it's not because young people are going in the same rate that they used to in previous generations. It's just older people are going more. And so pretty much everybody under the age of about 35, 40, they're just not going to movies at the rate that they used to. And with the exception of, like I said, some of those really big event movies, I just don't see the motivation most of the time. So
I think it's going to become more of a novelty experience than anything else. Kind of like going to an amusement park, right? You pay a lot of money to go to it. You maybe only go once or twice a year, but it's just something you do for the experience. One other comment quickly on the adapting part. You know, sometimes innovation isn't necessarily something new. For example, my wife and I are going to a drive-in tomorrow. Drive-in from decades ago, right?
Right.
And this drive-in theater,
you go in there after the sock cop?
Do what? Oh, yeah. I mean, you can safely social distance at a drive-in movie theater, and guess what they're showing? Amazon Prime videos or Amazon Prime movies.
That actually is pretty funny. But
I definitely think that it'll be like a more of a niche thing, and you can even see this with like some of the bigger theaters. I know specifically the one in Montgomery there that has those giant fancy leather seats and it has like the big 3D surround sound. Like, I think it'll be more of that niche experience. Like Chris said, there won't be like a movie theater that has maybe 12 or 15 rooms in it. It'll probably just be a couple of larger, more about the experience rooms. Because I've also heard of ones where it's like a private movie theater where you have recliners, but you still have a very large screen. So maybe it's going more into that niche market where it's an event rather than a like weeknight thing that you do with your family.
Yeah, and one form that might take actually is dine-in theaters, which have become really big in Texas. I've got a buddy in Texas that talks about them. Like, basically, it's a restaurant combined with a movie theater, and it's like a Chili's or one of those other restaurants, a Red Robin or something like that, where they're actually known for their food and their movies, which is really interesting because it's gotten a lot better even for regular movie theaters. But I can remember as a kid, the food at the movie theater, with the exception of the popcorn, was awful. Like, nobody ever wanted to eat at the movie theater. And now we've gone to the other extreme to where the food is like a sit-down restaurant at the movie theater now. And that's probably one of those things that they have to innovate to be able to bring people in more. I think that the amusement park analogy is actually really good, Chris, because I think what you're going to see start happening is that instead of a big city having like 20 movie theaters and every little small town across America having one, you're going to see to where only big cities have movie theaters, and they're going to have like 2 or 3. And so I think that that's probably the direction we wind up taking this. So I think that has already somewhat answered our final question, but I do want to ask it because I think that it could take the conversation, we could flesh it out a little bit more. Do you think theaters wind up winning this fight, or do you think the movie studios themselves wind up winning this fight? Because one thing we have learned about this is the movie studios seem to prefer the other one. And when you look at the economic side of it, when you find out that the studios wind up turning about 80% profit as opposed to the 50% that they turn when they're going through movie theaters, I mean, I think it's very clear that the studios want to win this fight. They want to make it to where video on demand is not something they have to wait contractually 60 days for like they have in the past. So who do you think winds up winning that fight?
I definitely think that it will be the studios that end up winning, and it just makes sense to cut all the cost, right? Because the studio doesn't have to pay for those giant reels and send them to all the companies and make contractual deals with all of these different places. They can just plug and play into whatever streaming service that they want to use. Like, for example, if it is Amazon Prime that they want to put their product on, they make one deal instead of making, let's say, 30 across all the different kinds of movie theaters that, like chain movie theaters that are in the US or other places. So it makes sense for them to cut on the cost, and they're the people with the product. So really the only bargaining power that the theaters have is if the people get involved. And I don't think that the people will want to get involved to help the theaters win. Now, there may be niche markets like drive-ins or like that dining-in experience that will stay afloat because of the experience aspect, but I don't see like your common small-town movie theater living through this when internet is so prevalent and the consumer wants it and the studio producing the product wants it. It just doesn't make sense to me. They would only stay afloat for what? Why would they be there?
Yeah, you brought up a really good point, because the thing that we have to remember is movie theaters are not Walmart. They have one product. Like, yes, they sell other things, but that's only in conjunction of their one product. And so if a company decides to give Walmart or Best Buy or another big box store they run around, they can say, all right, you can take your product somewhere else and we just won't carry you. They have bargaining power in that situation. With the movies, and I know that AMC came out recently and said that they're not going to air any Universal movies because Universal opened up Trolls before that 60-day period and didn't allow them to keep it in the theaters for 60 days. They just went straight to video on demand. Then AMC's like, well, we're not going to run any more Universal movies. Oh, you're not going to run the new Fast and Furious movie? Okay. They can just go to Carmike Cinemas, your competition, and that'll take all your business away from it. You're going to get zero off of that product. And so, I mean, if you're looking at it from an economic standpoint, I think that it's just clear as a bell that the studios definitely have the upper hand in this fight.
If you want to say who's going to win the fight, who owns the IP, right? Who owns the product? The movie theater is simply packaging the product and presenting it, and the only thing that's really keeping them afloat is the contractual obligations. So if the theater is having to resort to threatening or maybe trying to get legislation involved or something like that to win the dispute, that pretty much shows that they don't have the power to win out in the end. And so, yeah, I mean, if AMC is not going to show Universal movies, well, guess who will? Amazon will, Netflix will. They'd love to pay for that privilege. And so, like I mentioned earlier, some businesses are going to adapt and some are going to try to fight it. But the ones who are trying to fight it are fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah, and one thing that you brought up that, of course, as a political person, I always think about first, I really can't come up with a way that they would even craft legislation to do what you're talking about. Because usually when innovation comes up, what happens is the old guard tries to come up with laws to circumvent market forces and somehow stop the new technology from winding up being something that's prevalent. I really can't even come up with a way that they could even try to do that in this situation. Like, how would they even make the case to the voters that this is something that was in their best interest? Politically speaking, I don't know that they could even try that at this point. Maybe they could, and I'm sure that they're going to try, but I don't think that you could figure out a way to even shoehorn that in.
I feel like the only case that they could make for that would be something like it's a public service like a park, or it's something historical that people need to be able to go to. And that's such a weak argument. I think there is zero way that they win.
Right. If it's a historic thing, like maybe a really famous movie theater in New York, okay. But if we're talking about your average multi-cinema that's, doing most of the business now, I just can't see them doing that on a wide scale. Like, they're not going to bail out Carmike and AMC and all of the other big theater corporations. Maybe some individual ones on a case-by-case basis get some kind of government assistance, but they're not the big players that are showing all of the big new movies anyway, so I don't even know if that enters into the conversation. All right, guys, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it, and we appreciate you listening to us. I mean, there's no question that this virus has had some really crazy side effects, some things that we kind of figured would happen, some things we had no idea that was going to happen, and we've kind of talked about both of those tonight, but love to hear your thoughts. Spout off in the comments below if you think that movies, esports, what direction they go with, what form that takes when all of this ends and we start actually going out and functioning like a society again. How does that change? Love to hear what your thoughts are on that. Make sure to check back with us next week for the Geekend and Monday through Thursday for the regular Tactic Show right here on YouTube, Facebook, Mixer, Twitch, Twitter. We're on basically all the platforms. If you're not watching us, that's really a you problem. We'll be back with you next week. In the meantime, stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalreda Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.